Good afternoon. This is Professor David Weiss from New Jersey City University and our continuing podcast programming from the Institute for Dispute Resolution and Connecting Bridges and Borders. Today's conversation is a conversation that I'm excited to hear about, and I'm sure all of my listeners as well will be very interested. It's on 5G and understanding 5G. And today we have someone that is an expert, not only in the United States, but around the world. Walt Sapronov. He is with Sapronov Associates. His firm is based in Atlanta. They have offices in Washington and Moscow, and he represents telecommunication platforms and organizations all over the world. Welcome to our show today, Walter. Walt, how are you?
Good. Thank you, Professor. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
So let's start off, as I always do with most of my guests. I'd like to just a little bit for our listeners about your background. Give us a little bit of understanding of what you do and your engagement in the practice of law, as well as other factors of things that you may do in the world that our listeners may find of interest.
Okay. First of all, I'm just that. I'm a lawyer. Been practicing about 35 years. Our practice is focused exclusively on telecommunications. Primarily, I'm a deal lawyer, work on telecom deals, transactions, commercial agreements, with a big emphasis on regulatory compliance. We've done, that is to say, negotiated and consummated telecom transactions of all sorts and flavors of every telecom technology you can think of: mobile, terrestrial, satellite, cable. We've represented carriers. We've represented large Fortune 50 companies in sourcing of telecommunications, have worked on cross-border telecom matters, and most recently we've represented clients in a new technology called 5G, and we'll share some of our thoughts with you about that.
Wonderful. And it's great to have your dearth of experience, because you've seen over the years, some transitions as we move from sort of the tower conversations of cell tower installations now into this new paradigm of 5G. So let's kick it off. What is 5G?
Broadly speaking, it's a term, as you mentioned, that refers to new mobile technology. The technical definition is actually promulgated by an international standards organization called the ITU, which is an agency of the United Nations, or the UN. The ITU, or International Telecommunication Union, essentially prescribes standards that manufacturers all over the world use to develop equipment. With respect to 5G, which stands for the latest generation of mobile technology, there was 4G LTE. Before that, there was 3G. The new standard is being developed by something called the Third Generation Partnership Project, or 3GPP. Now, there's a lot of alphabet soup here, but the important take home here is that you'll want to go to the ITU's website. You look up 5G and new radio, or 5G NR, and then, and I'll try to keep this to a limit, the technical discussion to a limit, but you want to remember something called IMT-2020. It's a publication that defines everything that you're going to want to know about 5G from a technical standpoint. So 5G has additional connotations in addition to just the standard and new technology. There are applications associated with 5G. You may have heard about the Internet of Things, or machine-to-machine communication. The distinguishing characteristic of 5G is that it promises exponentially more bandwidth than we've seen before. Regulators are opening up bandwidth, including bandwidth in so-called ultra-high frequencies. And with this additional bandwidth, some of which will come from satellite, there will be the capabilities of delivering much more mobile data than we've seen in the past. This is all largely a couple of years away. The initial deployment of 5G is something called enhanced mobile broadband, and quite frankly, it's nothing more than souped up LTE or souped up 4G. The more interesting stuff will be applications around ultra low latency communications. Self-driving cars are an example of that. And then you'll have massive machine type communications for Internet of Things and communication among sensor devices, so that things with sensors can communicate to one another. For the techies, this is really a global mesh network of any-to-any communications. And there are some other technologies that you want to be aware of, or one wants to be aware of if you're doing anything serious in this regard. You want to be aware of massive MIMO, which are antenna arrays, so you can deliver a cascade of signals. Beamforming, which is exactly what it sounds like, manipulation of radio beams. CRAN, which is a centralized radio access network architecture that's distributed from distributed radio access network. And so all of that eventually will support and vision of a world where anything can communicate with anything using bandwidth. That's kind of the overview.
You know, that's really fascinating, and you bring up some interesting points to our listeners with respect to where it began organically on the standards level, as well as this whole what we'll call techie sort of opportunity of really how data can be expanded into the 10th degree or 10th power. So keeping that in mind, we'll come back to that conversation in a moment in terms of what I want to ask you on maybe some things that you referred to as standards. But the first question I think a lot of people have out there, although they may recognize immediately that this is going to open up enormous amounts of opportunity in terms of advancements and usage, as you point out. What about the health concerns? And there are a lot of articles written about this. There's a lot of issues that are brought before different governing bodies, both here and abroad, that 5G may come with some concerns for human beings. Can you expand or elaborate on your understanding about these issues?
Yeah, I think that all falls under the topic that we would call 5G mythology. First of all, regarding health standards, and let's take the US. The FCC, Federal Communication Commission, the entity charged by Congress to oversee the public interest, allocate radio spectrum, grant radio licenses. The FCC has a statutory mandate to protect you and me from harmful radio emissions of whatever sort they may be. The FCC is recently in the press announcement, including one by one of the FCC commissioners who gave a speech the other day, says this is just false. This is hype. The FCC is carefully watching the development of 5G, is encouraging the development of 5G. And let me share with you just some experience as an attorney representing clients before the FCC involving matters of RF emissions that have to do with safety. First, RF emission protection is codified. That is to say, you have regulations and a statute that requires the FCC to protect us from harmful radio emissions. Part 15 of the FCC's rules is where you want to look, and the statute is in the Communications Act, Section 302. The enforcement of those protections is done by something called the FCC Spectrum Enforcement Division. And I've had the pleasure, if you want to call it that, of representing clients who have violated or allegedly violated some of those standards in dealings with the Spectrum Enforcement Decision. Suffice it to say that it's a very serious discussion. There are monetary penalties. There are investigations, and everything from the Bluetooth that I wear to the mobile handset to billboards to laptops all have to go through RF emissions testing. When a company, for example, imports devices, let's say from China, that was not tested to specification, or perhaps worse, manage to somehow intentionally elude testing requirements, there are very serious penalties, very serious consequences. The discussions usually will end with a fine and a consent decree, which again is no fun at all for the entity that violates those emission protections. There are other regulations regarding antennas. There are environmental regulations. There's the National Historical Preservation Act. Of course, there are local siting rules. So I would say that as a practical matter, the idea that 5G will somehow elude regulatory scrutiny, cause health concerns, the likelihood, the percentage of that is around 0. And the myth that 5G operators that are really going to cause COVID or other health concerns, it's a little bit akin to the Salem witch trials. It's a modern day witch hunt. I may want to add a final observation that maybe your listeners would find interesting. As you know, we have offices in Moscow, so we try to stay tuned with what is happening in that part of the world as well as what is happening here. And according to Wikipedia, a New York Times reporter has blamed RT America, some say a Russian propaganda outlet, for spreading dissemination about the harmful effects of 5G. Now, the FCC and other authorities have denied such links, but meanwhile, 5G deployment in Russia is apparently proceeding just fine, and it involves a deal between one of Russia's largest telephone companies and a company called Huawei. And perhaps we will talk a little bit more about Huawei coming up in this discussion. Suffice this to say that the apocalyptic concerns about 5G, well, largely nonsense. The concerns about security are not.
So that's a great overview, and we're going to go into the security question in a moment. But before we do, some of the points that you've raised, I think are really interesting about standards and regulatory framework. Are there right now pending anywhere, whether it's within the UN, WHO, or other world bodies, any standards that are being framed for international treaties or model law that countries may be willing or interested in participating in that will sort of govern best practices when it comes to 5G?
Yes, and in particular, the one that you want to pay attention to and the one that your listeners will want to pay attention to is the World Radio Conference, or WRC. The last one was held in Egypt last November. Essentially, it is an international standards group that meets, that establishes radio bandwidth coordination, interconnectivity worldwide. And of course, you have different entities that will participate in it. Sometimes those international conferences become politicized, and you may find, say, the agenda of the United States perhaps not represented and viewpoints not shared by perhaps countries that are may perhaps be hostile to our interests, or at least don't necessarily see eye to eye to what we do. So
I'm sorry, Walt.
That would be the one to look at right now. And
yeah, and is that a self-regulatory body, or is that affiliated with a recognized international platform like the United Nations?
It's a well-recognized international platform. You need it in order for your cell phone to be able to work here and in Paris, Norway, India, and so on. You have to have international world radio coordination.
So these are treaties that are then adopted and ratified by nation states.
Exactly.
Understood. So that's really important information, I think, for our listeners to recognize how then these cross-border regulatory frameworks then coincide with one another. It sounds like it's through this organization.
World Radio Conference and the ITU. So if there are two entities, two bodies that you want to take a look at, World Radio Conference in particular is going to be looking at 5G and the use of delivery of 5G signals through something called LEO satellites, or LEO low entry orbit constellations. Historically we're used to geostationary satellites operate in a fixed geostationary orbit around the Earth. The new satellites will have constellations that are much lower. There'll be a lot more of them, and you'll need them for the delivery of multiple 5G signals that is contemplated both here and abroad.
Well, now that raises, I think, the real more technical questions, and that is about security. So let's first talk about, let's parcel this out for our listeners. Let's talk about security in general, because you're talking about satellites that will be, these 5G networks will be very dependent upon these low atmospheric satellites. And you're also talking about security in terms of the installations of the 5G networks and who has access and who doesn't to them. So perhaps maybe you could take a shot at both these sort of parts of the security discussion.
If I may, let me share the backdrop of the security concerns here. And before we get into the weeds on this, let me give just a very, very brief overview about how telecommunications security how it works in this country, in the sense of what is the framework, the overall governmental framework. There are some, again, some agencies, some statutes in general that one should know. The first one that comes to mind is CFIUS, Congressional Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. It has recently been expanded under something called FIRMA. And some people view this as really part of our protectionist trade policy that scrutinizes foreign investment, but also to some extent it dovetails with perhaps the trade war, if that's what you want to call it, with China. Because historically, well, we've had open technological borders, primarily with China, but with many other countries in the world. Investments in the US, where they threaten or they implicate infrastructure, they are subject to a review called CFIUS, comprised of various members, and this is in addition to FCC review under something called Team Telecom. So the CFIUS review, again, authorized by Congress, we'll give you an example with one that we were involved in, where we had an investor in the Middle East investing in a large telecommunication network, where we secured all the approvals, all that was necessary from the FCC, from Team Telecom, that at that point include the Department of Justice, the Homeland Security Administration, but there were CFIUS concerns raised by Congress that this perhaps was a little bit close to home when it comes to actually having access to what drives this country and having access to communication within the U.S. So the end result was a national security agreement, or an NSA, that had to be agreed to by the entity in order to be able, and along with, of course, continued reporting requirements, monitoring, self-reporting, other protections that were in place to make sure that that the integrity of our networks was protected. Then there is also, of course, that the company everybody's talking about, Huawei. Huawei is one of the world's largest telecommunication manufacturers. It's Chinese-based, and it has equipment that's embedded here in the U.S., has for years. It is very popular in Europe, and it basically covers half the globe. When Sprint was in the process of being acquired by SoftBank, the crown jewel of Sprint was a company called Clearwire. SoftBank wanted Clearwire, which even then, I've forgotten how many years ago was this, but it was broadband mobile communication. Huawei was deeply embedded in Clearwire, and one of the requirements under the CFIUS review was that Sprint, Clearwire, get rid of Huawei. That now has been extended even further, and as recently as last week, we had an executive order from the president regarding foreign investment in U.S. telecommunications, where Team Telecom now has been expanded throughout with officials from the Department of Defense, executive agencies. Let me give you an example, practical example of how this used to work. You want to get approval, whether it's wireline or wireless technology from the FCC, and you go and you get authorization. Sometimes it's 214. And you go to the FCC, and if it's no big deal, they say fine. And you go with its so-called streamline processing, goes on streamline. After a certain period of time, you're good to go. If something's fishy, then the FCC will refer it to Team Telecom. Team Telecom has indicated with Justice Department, Homeland Security, FBI. There's something wrong with there. I don't like the idea of this person from South America having interest in this communications, a little bit too close to Florida, too close to Cuba, whatever. I'm making this up. Those be the kind of concerns that would come up. Now Team Telecom has been expanded, where it's going to have full executive review, and importantly, there is going to be retroactive review. The company that they're looking at right now is China Telecom, that has received approval already to operate here in the U.S. and is going to be under retroactive review. In other words, you got the authorization, attorneys gave opinions, no consent required, all approvals have been obtained, reps and warranties, deal closed. Well, maybe not. And so you have this change of law, if you will, that is going to involve much greater scrutiny of foreign investment in telecommunication infrastructure.
Now, Walt, are you finding this to also be, because we heard before the pandemic, when we look at, for example, the EU as well as for the United Kingdom, there was a move to have Huawei installed throughout the United Kingdom, as well as through EU member states. Are you finding that similar activities of retroactive or looking now backwards, are you finding that they're now reconsidering the Huawei? I'm
not sure about the UK or other European nations. Not all of them are friendly to this administration, shall I say. And we have elections coming up soon that create a new dynamic. So right now, just looking at the way things stand, now Huawei is equipment supplier non gratis here in the United States. And the question is, what do you do about it? Well, this in fact was going to be part of the discussion on investment in the US. In the US, there is something called the Universal Service Fund, or the USF, a fund to which all telecommunication providers contribute, not just carriers, but others. And it's used to support telecommunication, wireline and broadband and others for the less fortunate in rural areas or where it's costly to build out such areas. And there is now on the table a proposal that will involve use of USF funds to dislodge and replace Huawei equipment.
That's the interesting part. I like to, again, these are very complicated parts of the discussion on security. I'd like to just go back a moment to your explanation of these low sort of level satellites that are sort of the connectors to how the 5G system will work. Who is going to control those, and what are the security measures to protect them in the event of what I call realpolitik, which is nation state or self-interest that could lead to national security concerns?
What I'm going to do on that one, if I can, David, is ask if we could have another discussion in which I would like to bring a colleague of mine who has a degree in satellite engineering from MIT, who's our resident satellite expert and who also practices law. And he was with the law firm of Wilkie Farr and Gallagher in New York and worked on deals, including Loran and others. So that, if you, that's a deep in a weed discussion.
Yeah, and I'd love to host your colleague on another part. We'll call it part 2 of this discussion, because I think as you're talking, Walt, it really is very fascinating. While everyone's sort of talking about the debunked health issues or the mythical health issues. I think the real question is more about, as we roll out our 5G systems, 5G is becoming really the most important part of the next evolution of technology development worldwide. And therefore, the real conversation should be more about the security conversations and what do we need to be aware of, and what do we need to have in terms of regulatory framework vis-a-vis some of the things that you're currently explaining that appear to be, in some cases, based on some of your remarks today, real time as well, in terms of some of the new decisions that are being pivoted, perhaps due to the COVID-19 or perhaps just for other reasons within the United States government. But what I'd like to do is, our sort of pivot out of the security question for a moment, because it's something we could at least have I think a 3-day seminar, and for our listeners, at least it gives them something to think about and to understand the complexities involving 5G. And let's talk about the business opportunities. Where do you see the business opportunities in this new playing field?
Okay, perhaps if you would permit me, as a segue from our last discussion to this, there's also such a thing as economic security. And regarding satellites, including an organization called Intelsat that coordinates satellites communications, and then in fact has various satellites in orbit that are used for various frequency bands, including C-band. There is the concern about bankruptcy. And the bankruptcy of a satellite company is something that is very real, something that we can talk about separately. And in fact, at one point, there was a well-known hedge fund known as Aurelius that essentially, by filing a lawsuit involving the violation of certain bond covenants, tried to drive Intelsat into bankruptcy, even as it was making money by shorting the stock and doing a credit default swap play on the demise, what it hoped to be the demise of Intelsat. That happened also with Windstream, where Aurelius was successful in doing that. They tried to do that to the government of Argentina. When you're talking about security, it's not just technical security, not just the possibility of somebody blowing a satellite or bird out of space in Star Wars fashion. Economic security is also something perhaps that we should talk about in this context.
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to on the economic security, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this sort of originates out of the Cape Town Accord agreement with space financing, and how some of these bankruptcies or insolvencies would be administered on a global basis. Is that sort of where the genesis of some of those economic security issues are coming from?
No, I think the forum of choice, the court of choice for bankruptcies of companies is the Southern District of New York.
Okay.
And in fact, when you have U.S. investors that are investing in a company, in whether it has international investors or not, as you know, if it's a foreign company, it trades on the New York Stock Exchange with ADRs. But if it is traded on the U.S. Stock Exchange and it sells bonds like many foreign controlled entities here do, this would be a bankruptcy that would be addressed in the Southern District of New York. And there are very complex rules I've had occasion to look at recently regarding the recognition by the Southern District of New York under Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code of a bankruptcy decree issued by another sovereign state. But here, just more broadly speaking, satellites historically thought of them being just a great investment. Perhaps there are concerns there when you're over leveraged, as you have with any other aspect of the economy, telecom being no exception. We went through the WorldCom crisis. We're very much involved with the WorldCom bankruptcy. We're envisioning that there's going to be an act two to that because of the COVID crisis and because of what is happening right now. I just bring that as something.
No, it's a very fascinating angle to this discussion, especially when it comes to the international nexus to how the investor pool or investor syndicates are created, and then ultimately who's going to wind up controlling these assets, and whether or not under the regulatory framework that the original syndicates were approved, would they be approved inside the bankruptcy, let's say, of what for our listeners, not to get too technical, but a 363 asset purchase sale of those rights.
Yeah, the purpose of a 363 sale is that you're going to get the asset free and clear of liens. Well, let's hope you do, if in fact you do, and when we advise clients on 363 sale matters, but also if there is, and perhaps you may want to think back to a company called NextWave that was formerly owned, that also went into bankruptcy, as did one of our other early CLEC clients. When there's an issue before the as to whether the FCC or the bankruptcy court controls, where say the bondholders want to stop the bleeding and the cash burn, and want to liquidate the company as soon as possible, and the FCC says, wait a second, we can't let people out there be without service, as between the bankruptcy court and the FCC, who wins? The answer is undecided.
Very complex. Very complex.
Very complex. So you just added another dimension to that, which is the international angle.
Right.
Maybe again, we're getting a little bit further afield from 5G, but perhaps we can have a part two to this discussion on
what it does, Walt, is it helps our listeners, I think, really just understand that 5G from a usage standpoint is a necessary element going forward. But for our policymakers and regulatory frameworks and the communities that are approving the 5G infrastructure, asking the right pointed questions about some of these issues will, I think, not only ultimately help assuage people, but also give them an understanding as to what they need to be looking for in terms of that security, or on a national level, the national security question. So to sort of summarize where we're at, I always like to leave on a note of how to also create business. And I think there's some great opportunities within the 5G space. And I'd like to hear from you, where do you see people, stakeholders, playing in 5G at this point, and opportunities that they can be involved in?
Okay. So if we go back to, again, some of our experience, we've been fortunate enough to have represented clients in wireless network build-outs with 3G, with LTE. Ericsson is the leading provider of wireless infrastructure in the US. And we are looking at LTE, 4G, or 5G. And keep in mind that the initial deployments of 5G will be anchored on existing LTE networks. You don't just tear everything out by the roots. The core of that is an IP core, Internet Protocol core, and the leading provider in that space, well known, of course, is Cisco. So if you want to say who will be the dominant players that you can look to that certainly will continue to play a role, Cisco and Ericsson immediately come to mind. Of course, Nokia is a major player when it comes to handsets. But one thing to make note of is that because of the importance of 5G, because of diversity of supply chain, the concerns we now have, because perhaps we put too much of the supply chain in the hands of foreign entities. Congress right now is pushing for something called an open RAN. I mentioned radio access network RAN before, C-RAN, D-RAN. Well, now they're looking for an open RAN, which will be essentially be an open interface. In the software world, think of TCP/IP as opposed to proprietary network architecture that allowed everyone to build to specs. So if the semiconductor manufacturers can actually start developing chipsets and semiconductors around a technology that's not proprietary, well, then how did Mao Zedong put it? Let 100 flowers bloom. I'm not sure. That's the quote I should be uttering right now, given what's happening in China. But that's sort of the idea. So that's something to look into. And fiber. None of this can work without fiber. There's going to be lots and lots of fiber required. Fiber deployment, companies like Corning and others that supply fiber, there's going to be lots of demand for it because without fiber, it's not going to work. And even if you have pole attachments that support a radio device that's attached to a pole, you still have to pull fiber in order to get to it. The FCC has already pushed forward regulations, preemption of local barriers to entry. Doesn't matter if somebody doesn't like the way it looks from their backyard. We're going to continue to push 5G, and part of that involves deployment of antennas, but also involves deployment of fiber. Another area that I think is very ripe for investment, and I'll say that based on our experience, is testing. And the reason I say that is this. One of the metrics one hears about with 5G is latency. A lot of people are talking about latency. I think I've already mentioned ultra reliable, low latency communication for self-driving cars. But latency, how long does it take for this signal to traverse the globe? You're in New York, I'm in Atlanta. Hopefully I'm not sounding robotic. So that means there's low latency communication, and this is an LTE 4G connection through T-Mobile. Well, 5G is going to require still lower latency because of the distances and because of the exponentially greater bandwidth. So when you are doing that kind of testing, and say you're negotiating an agreement, and you say, okay, I want to buy something, but I don't want to buy it as is. I don't want to buy a pig in a poke. I want to buy a car, and I want to make sure it works and the wheels don't fall off. Okay, you're going to give me some warranties here, some specs, and the buzzword that people usually throw around is SLAs, service level agreements. Well, if you're pushing for SLAs, and SLAs can mean a number of things. They can mean nothing more than hype, and a lot of people, including perhaps inexperienced negotiators, think an SLA is hype and that's meaningful. It's not. It can be a warranty. Somebody's drafted by attorneys such as myself where it is meaningful, and a failure gives rise to a lawsuit for breach. Or more often it means basically a remedy. This happens, you get a credit. This happens, you will have a right to terminate the agreement, which is about as useful as having having a divorce because you and your wife had an argument over dinner. You have credits, remedies, specifications. So what are you going to do with something as new as 5G? Well, you can get your metrics and you can pound the table and push for it. But how do you know if they work? And you're not going to know they work until the testing equipment is there. And as recently as 2 months ago, it's not.
That's interesting.
From my own personal experience, it's just not there yet. So testing, 5G testing, the metrics. Now recall what I said before about the definitions in ITU. We are now finishing up with release 15 of the 5G NR spec. Next year, we're going to be moving to release 16. That's why it's important to go through the weeds, get your engineers, your IT guys, and look through some of these specifications, find those metrics, and then figure out how you're going to test them. So testing is going to be a very important component in the deployment of networks, both on the wireless side and on the fiber side. If you're negotiating an agreement and it's end-to-end performance and you want to make sure that you have an experience, you're sitting there at the Yankees, watching a Yankees game, and you want to pick up, see old videos of Joe DiMaggio. Well, what's the experience going to look like and what's going to feel like? Well, how do you measure that experience? You have to have parameters, you have to have testing, both for the wireline, for the wireless and for the fiber. WDM capable OTDR antenna arrays. That's not something you usually learn in contract law and law school. But if you're going to be doing these deals, you better get at least somebody familiar with the terminology, what I just referred to as wavelength division multiplexing using optical time division reflectometer. But it's those kinds of in-depth discussions that are eventually going to be meaningful. And if you know what you're doing, you're going to get people in the room who do know what they're doing, so that when the thing doesn't work, say, sorry.
Yeah, and that shows again, as we talked before in my opening statement, the complexities of what 5G is. And I believe that today's show really illustrates through the commentary that you've provided, Walt, that this is a conversation that has very many complex tentacles to it, both in terms of understanding its use, understanding its opportunities, understanding the security, the bifurcation of the security issues, both from the satellite level as well as from the infrastructure itself, the licensing concerns, the cross-border cooperation issues, the organizations nationally and internationally that are involved in this. The exciting part is that it is exciting because it's going to allow human evolution at a level that we probably can't even fathom as we sit now in modern times back, many of us in our homes, waiting for a better day. But hopefully 5G will be part of that better day story as long as it's navigated and steered properly. So I want to thank you for taking your time and letting our audience get a little bit of a snippet of what 5G is and how it's being currently discussed at so many multiple levels. And once again, this is Professor Weiss signing off on another podcast program from New Jersey City University's Institute for Dispute Resolution under its flagship program, Connecting Bridges and Borders. Until next time, I bid adieu. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Walter.